Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Scots, A Genetic Journey by Alistair Moffat, narrated by Ruth, Urquhart. Publisher's note: this audiobook may refer to visual elements included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Note to the new edition. Ancestral DNA is a fast-moving branch of knowledge, and its links with more traditional historiography are still developing as each discipline informs the other. This new edition of The Scots, A Genetic Journey includes recent findings on early farming and its migrations, Neanderthal DNA, the classic Celtic DNA Y chromosome haplogroup, the Royal Stuart lineages, and physical characteristics such as red hair and blue eyes. With every passing year, the picture painted by this new fusion becomes clearer, more detailed and brighter. Alistair Moffat, March 2017. Introduction. The Crowd. Every year, in the doughy days of February and early March, Scotland comes to Edinburgh. From the platforms of Waverley and Haymarket stations, from buses parked at King's Stables Road, from cars left in the western suburbs, an army musters. The yellow of the Lion rampant and the blue of the Saltire standards flutter as tens of thousands march west out of the centre of the city, flooding like a tartan tide along Shandwick Place, West Maitland Street, past Donaldson's Hospital to Roseburn and the old battleground. To join the national muster, northerners come down on the morning trains from Inverness and Aberdeen. From the west, Argyll, Ayrshire and Glasgow, they rattle through in commuter carriages or join the high-speed queue that is the M8. From the borders, once the heartland, they arrive in their thousands. It is the journey of an army of hope that often ends in despairing, rancorous retreat. It is Scotland playing rugby at Murrayfield. The sea of expectant faces, 67,000 strong, most of them gasping with exasperation or shouting encouragement to the team wearing navy blue, knows that Scotland can beat any team in the world, except New Zealand, and can lose to any team in the world. But they glory in their day and its lurching swings of emotion, the crowd a counterpoint to the play on the pitch. All follow the unscripted drama, pause for breath at stoppages, roar at breaks and thrusts, groan at breakdowns and mistakes. For an afternoon, Scotland, Scottishness and being Scots behave like an organism, like an unwitting microcosm of a nation. In many important ways, the Murrayfield crowd is just that. Allowing for the supporters of visiting teams, it represents 1% of the population. The stands are filled with men, women and children from the Highlands, Aberdeenshire and Tayside, Perthshire and Fife, from the Clyde coastlands, from Galloway and the borders and the cities of Scotland. The days of a male-dominated rugby crowd are long gone now, and while women may not make up 50%, the proportion is large. What superficially binds and identifies the crowd are their iconography and a sense of shared history. Kilts, flags worn as capes, face paints, CU Jimmy hats and national rugby jerseys are part of the carnival uniform. And when Scotland needs slightly different sorts of exhortation, the team is advised to remember Bannockburn or, alternatively, remember Flodden. Before hostilities begin, Flower of Scotland is sung to a dirge-like tune. The anthem recalls the triumph at Bannockburn as though it were a matter for mourning. Proud Edward's army is defeated, and in an unlikely anachronism, Robert the Bruce is said to have sent him homeward to think again. Kings and battles, flags and tartan, these appear to be the stuff of history for the crowd. A procession of armies across Scotland's landscape, the drama of warfare and raid, picturesque ruins, important dates, are all lines in a familiar recital. Until the 19th century, the story of Scotland circled around the doings and decisions of elites, of tiny groups of powerful and interconnected people. Monarchs, aristocrats and churchmen actually made history, or at least had control over its recording. Over most of the vast span of all that experience in what is now Scotland, there was simply no place for the stories of ordinary lives, of the agricultural labourers whose back-breaking toil formed the landscape, the tradesmen whose skills made the work easier, and the masons who built the great churches, castles and grand houses. The Murrayfield crowd cannot know anything about these unrecounted generations, except for one simple thing, that they were their ancestors. And that irreducible fact is the rock upon which this book and all the research behind it is built. As the tramp of invading armies echoes and fades, and in the long shadows behind the stately line of kings and noblemen and their stately homes, we may now at last be able to make out the modest outline of a people's history of Scotland, our people, ourselves, our history, a story of Scotland we can all own. The Murrayfield crowd hold it inside themselves, a long hidden story of unlikely and unsurprising links, a story that reaches back beyond kings and queens to the very beginnings of settlement in Scotland after the end of the last ice age, a story that is more than 11,000 years old. It is the story of our DNA. Every Scot is an immigrant. Until 9000 BC, Scotland was empty of people and animals. For 15,000 years, ice, more than a kilometre thick in places, had crushed the land under a pitiless white sterility where nothing could live. When the ice sheets finally retreated, small bands of pioneers moved north into a virgin landscape. Their names are not known, but scientists have been able to discover a great deal about where they came from. Immigrants arrived in what would become Scotland over thousands of years, well into the historical period. And their descendants are still here, flourishing, carrying on the long journey of their genes. By approximately AD 1000, the process was almost complete, and most of the pieces of our patchwork of DNA were in place. Significant but small groups did come to Scotland after 1000, but in statistical terms, their impact was minimal. This is why the balance of this book is heavily tilted towards prehistoric and early historic times. DNA research works best in a chronological context, and that is the reason for the first landmarks in our history being clearly plotted in this story, although some of these turn out to be misleading. Language and its development are closely linked to who we are and where we came from, and the evolution of Old Welsh, Scots, English and Gaelic is an important theme. There exist fascinating linguistic links, and many of them were forged in deep time, tens of thousands of years ago, as our ancestors crossed seas and rivers to walk into empty landscapes and populate the earth. As well as Y chromosomes, men inherit surnames, and as these came increasingly into common use in the early modern period, they help set genetic findings against a familiar background. For example, Scotland's Highland clans often claim descent from a common name father, but recent research shows that some of these men may have been fathers in more than name only. None of what follows would have been possible without the pioneering work of two scientists working in the universities of California. In the 1960s, Professor Luca Cavalli-Sforza was the first to apply genetics to history, and he used the first DNA markers to do this. These were the familiar blood groups, ABO, rhesus, and so on. Earlier research had shown that these differed between populations across the world, and using these findings, Cavalli-Sforza built a version of a family tree that showed how populations were related to each other. What puzzled him and others was the deep difference between populations in Africa. A New Zealander of Scots descent, Professor Alan Wilson, began to study mitochondrial DNA, what women pass on through the female line to their daughters and to their sons, but it dies with them. He saw how individuals, and not just populations, were related to each other through their DNA. And because these branches of connection were longest in Africa, Wilson and his team made the earth-shattering announcement that the human race had originated there. This caused uproar. Most scientists believed that Homo sapiens had descended from various ancestors around the world. The Chinese were thought to be the children of Peking man, the Southeast Asians came from Java man, and Europeans from the Neanderthals. The discovery that modern humans had walked out of Africa to populate the whole of the rest of the world was sensational, and it made headlines. Images of a real Garden of Eden suddenly came into focus. A mitochondrial Eve was pictured on the cover of Time magazine. Research began to gather pace. After a period of emphasis on mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome evidence was analysed and hundreds of new markers identified in the 1990s. Dating techniques improved, and some European lineages were shown to originate before the last ice age, while others had been brought into Europe by early farmers from the Middle East. At the same time, analysing DNA samples became simpler, faster and cheaper. All individuals had to do was spit into a plastic capsule. A kissing spit is advised as being sufficient, and a hawking spit is to be avoided for all sorts of reasons. Seal it and send it off to be processed. Very quickly, there were companies that, for a fee, would test DNA and explain it, and the results were uploaded to a series of databases. Worldwide, there are probably around 200,000 results for Y chromosome tests, and in Britain about 20,000. These come from people anxious to trace their family trees. They are large and reliable samples, and they are being constantly augmented and refined. Once a geneticist has the results of a DNA test, he looks at the database for other markers of the same sort. Many of these have locations or origins attached, and also other important genealogical information. This allows a context for new samples and makes all sorts of fascinating links, both geographical and historical. One of the most striking findings in this flurry of recent research is the story of the epic journey of our ancestors out of Africa. Whoever the Scots believe themselves to be now, they are descended from Africans. The same is true for the English, the Irish, the Russians, the Chinese, all of the rest of the peoples of the world. It is a wonderfully refreshing, iconic and redressing balance for centuries of racial prejudice to think that Homo sapiens and not-so-sapiens originated amongst people once routinely and widely believed to be subhuman. Instead, it is clear that Africans were once our mothers and fathers. At the other end of the chronology of DNA history, my own experience as a child touched on the insistent theme of this book, that of immigration. At school in Kelso, I sat next to Richard Mazur and Jot Vechari. I knew Dennis and Brian Polachek and Harry Tomchak and admired Leona Goldstein from, sadly, a distance. Their DNA, and that of the children of other Polish exiles, arrived in Scotland because of an accident of history and, as a further consequence of happenstance, was concentrated in Kelso. It now enriches Scotland and makes only one of thousands of links in the chain of stories that follows. Alistair Moffat, St Andrew's Day, 2010. 1. The Refuges. At the tips of its wing spread, the eagle's feathers fluttered in the warm updraft. Stalling and banking in the breeze, it suddenly, effortlessly soared high over the sunlit Clyde Valley. Through the clear air, the great bird flicked its head from side to side, looking down on an endless vista of rolling green grasslands watered by the river and its tributaries. Glinting in the sun, hundreds of small pools patterned the open landscape. Its attention caught by sudden movement, the eagle turned and spiraled downward to where 3 pools clustered. Their surfaces quivered as thunder stampeded past their shores. Trumpeting, their tusks swaying, a herd of mammoths crashed through the grassland, fleeing headlong from danger. Behind them, cave lions had brought down a calf, and as the dying animal thrashed, hooked tusks slashing in the air, its killers dug their incisors into its throat, choking out the life. The eagle could see that there would be no pickings later, for a pack of hyenas was circling, waiting for the lions to be gorged and sated. Elsewhere on the treeless plains, other prey grazed. Vast herds of wild horses ranged over wide pasture. With their lookout stallions skirting the fringes of the herds and the dominant mares keeping them together, the small horses could be difficult to bring down. Fast and wary, they could see or sniff trouble before it was upon them. But when mares broke off to drop their foals, usually at the dead of night, packs of wolves could pick them off. In the morning, there would be something left for a sharp-eyed eagle. Few predators were bold enough to take on the hard-charging woolly rhinoceros and the brown bears, bigger than grizzlies, that roamed the uplands. Through its long life in the skies above the grasslands, the eagle had seen only one predator with the guile, strength, and determination to attack any animal, no matter how fast, large, or ferocious. 3,000 generations ago, sometime around 58,000 BC, men and women walked north into Britain. At that time, it was the far northwestern peninsula of the European landmass. So much ice had formed around the poles and over Scandinavia that the level of the sea had fallen between 160 and 260 feet below modern norms. The weather was cold all year round, but dry, and few trees grew on the peninsula. But the rich summer grasslands drew herd animals northwards, and behind the reindeer, the wild horses, and the thundering herds of mammoths came small bands of hunters. They were human beings, but they were not like us. In 1856, near Düsseldorf in Germany, miners were quarrying a limestone canyon when they opened out a cave mouth. Inside lay a scatter of bones, parts of a skull, arm, and leg bones and ribs. They were very thick, and at first the miners believed they had come across the skeleton of a cave bear. When an amateur naturalist, Johann Karl Fuhlrott, and an anatomist, Hermann Schaffhausen, saw the bones, they realized immediately that they could only be human. But not because they were exactly like those of our subspecies, Homo sapiens. Skeletal remains found all over Europe have allowed a clear picture of the Neanderthals to be pieced together. With deep barrel chests, stout bones, and tremendous musculature, their stooped bodies were well adapted to cold climates. A reduced surface area prevented heat loss, and it seems likely that their bodies were comparatively hairy. Neanderthal skulls show a massive brow ridge, a receding chin with prominent cheekbones, and a larger brain case than Homo sapiens. Scientists believe that their big brains may have enabled greatly enhanced night vision, a valuable attribute for a society based almost exclusively on hunting and gathering. Neanderthal noses were large and flat, able to inhale and exhale a greater capacity. It used to be thought that this was another feature of a cold-adapted physique with a bigger nose warming freezing air a little to prevent it shocking the lungs. But recent research promotes a more likely and more elegant thesis. For very stocky bodies, exertion and a consequent rise in temperature could be difficult, and it may well be that the Neanderthals' noses acted as efficient heat exchangers, helping them cool down quickly. For skilled scientists, skeletons can be eloquent, offering a sure guide to living musculature, and it is possible to reconstruct accurately not only what these men and women looked like, but also how they used their bodies. Their powerful build speaks of a life of tremendous exertion, especially in their style of hunting. A Neanderthal was much stronger than the strongest Homo sapiens and was able to sprint at lightning speed across short distances. They needed to. Tools found at open-air sites and caves in southern England show some sophistication, but Neanderthals knew nothing of bows and arrows. They needed to get closer to their prey. Most of the stone implements found were for butchering carcasses and scraping hides and bones, and it seems that their spears were tipped only with sharp flakes of flint. Injuries deduced from skeletons suggest a dangerous, even ferocious approach to hunting. Neanderthals suffered severe wounds to their heads and upper bodies, and some even survived arm and leg breaks. One imaginative historian has noticed a parallel pattern of injuries to modern rodeo riders. It seems likely that Neanderthals attacked their prey directly, launching themselves at reindeer or wild horses, perhaps jumping on their backs to bring them down. Perhaps they even took on mammoths. Their weapons were almost certainly good enough to wound an animal, and hunters may have stopped to get close enough and then sprinted to attack and stab. Then they chased whatever they had hit. When blood loss had weakened, say, a horse, the Neanderthals brought it down through sheer speed and brute strength. As a dying animal kicked and thrashed, it could cause terrible wounds to its predator. The sense of these prehistoric hunters as ferocious, attacking the prey of the grasslands with a savagery that seems barely human, is reinforced by closer examination of their skeletons. Even in identifiably younger skulls, the teeth of Neanderthals show tremendous wear, and it seems that they use their mouths like a tool or a third hand. It may be that these people chewed hide to soften it and make it more workable for clothing or other domestic purposes. Their front teeth are much larger than those of Homo sapiens and curved so that they can grip as well as bite. Perhaps Neanderthal jaws were used to hold items while their hands worked on them, or perhaps they used their teeth as a weapon. Comparative studies have revealed that Neanderthal children probably matured faster than those of Homo sapiens, and these prehistoric people also died earlier, rarely living beyond their 30s. But the impression of a feral subspecies needs substantial qualification. Neanderthals cared about their dead and buried them in what looks like a ritual manner, composing the corpse in a fetal position before covering it over. Cooperative activities such as a drive of mammoths and woolly rhinos over a cliff in what is now the island of Jersey suggest that they could plan, think consequentially, and work in groups. That in turn suggests that they could articulate reasonably sophisticated speech. An examination of Neanderthal skulls shows their voice box was in the same place as Homo sapiens, and therefore capable of the same range. It also appears that their culture had some abstract sense of decoration. Beads made by Neanderthals have been found, and beautiful seashells collected for, it seems, no other purpose than the pleasure of looking at them and owning them. Across the south of England, archaeologists have found evidence for the activities of Neanderthals after 58,000 BC, but few skeletal remains. There is no doubt that by this time the herd animals at the centre of these people's lives had migrated when the climate warmed and the grass grew. But the hunters moved in tiny groups, and it may be that no more than 20 or 30 families inhabited prehistoric Britain 3,000 generations ago. That extraordinary scarceness makes it very difficult for archaeologists to discover more. Traces of the megafauna of the grasslands have been found in Scotland. Mammoth tusks have come to light in a dig near Kilmarnock, on the watershed hills between the Ayrshire coastal plain and the Clyde Valley. Perhaps it was killed by cave lions. But nothing of the northern forays of pioneering Neanderthal hunting bands has been found, even though it seems certain they followed the herds as they sought fresh pasture. No characteristic assemblages of their tools have yet been uncovered, and what happened after the time of the mammoths, hyenas and lions in Scotland erased almost everything, and makes it highly unlikely that any will ever be recognised. After 24,000 BC, the skies over Britain began to darken, storms blew, and the weather quickly grew colder. Winter snows stayed on the hilltops throughout the year, and the summers shortened. New grass came through later and later, and began to die away in the early autumn. As rain and sleet fell, the great herds were driven southwards, and when the cold gripped the land, their human predators fled with them. The last ice age was beginning. The causes of this drastic episode of climate change originated far out in space. For reasons related to the fluctuating gravitational pull of our sun on the planets, the Earth's orbit changed. For long periods in the last 500,000 years, it has revolved around the sun in an ellipse and not a near circle as it does now. At the extremes of an elliptical orbit, the Earth is further from its source of heat and light, and therefore temperatures drop dramatically. Added to this cycle of change is another deadly complication. Over the last 500,000 years, the angle of the Earth's axis has also altered, tilting the northern hemisphere away from the sun's rays. This has the effect of shifting the Arctic Circle several hundred miles southwards. In turn, this depresses temperatures even more, as the cold waters of the North Atlantic begin to turn away the warmth of the Gulf Stream. Over northern Europe, the ice crept down the hillsides and covered the frozen land. As hurricanes blew and storms raged, more snow fell, and it reflected the sun's rays back, insulating the ice beneath, and temperatures dropped even lower. Across the highest points of the ice sheet that had formed over Scotland, it was an average of -60 degrees Celsius. Nothing could live. At the height of the last ice age, the ice sheet over Scotland was more than a mile thick, and it extended far to the south, to a diagonal line from the South Wales coast over to the Humber estuary and a small enclave immediately to the north. It was a pitiless and utterly sterile landscape. As air flowed down from the summit of the ice dome over Ben Nevis and Rannoch Moor, tremendous winds blew, their extraordinary speeds enhanced by the lack of friction from the ice. The near-constant high pressure produced clear skies and endless white vistas of dazzling but devastating beauty. To the south of the sheet, conditions were different, but equally extreme. At the fringes of the ice, where the glaciers had begun to fray and crumble, low-pressure fronts travelled along the cliffs at the edge of the sheet, and they brought sleet, cloud, and very stormy conditions. Overall, the season's temperatures averaged -10 degrees. Below the line from South Wales to the Humber, southern England was a polar desert and had been entirely abandoned by animals and people. So much water had been locked up in the ice that global sea levels were lowered by 125 metres, and those fleeing frozen Britain could walk far to the warmer south. A broad region of steppe tundra covered northern Europe, and it was only south of the Loire Valley that refugees could travel over grassland and see the welcome herds of grazing animals. Those northern Neanderthal bands who sought refuge in the south also came across another species. Around 40,000 BC, Homo sapiens arrived in Europe, his ancestors having migrated out of eastern Africa 30,000 years before. Although slightly taller, these new people looked like modern humans, and we are their descendants. They spoke a developed language, possessed many skills, and as family bands crossed Europe from east to west, they thrived. Neanderthals had been hunting the grasslands and the forests for at least 100,000 years before, and it seems that, for a period, both subspecies coexisted. Numbers were very small. Only 5,000 or so people hunted in the whole of the area of modern France, and contact was probably rare. Europe was dominated not by people, but by animals, the huge herds and the megafauna of the time before the onset of the last ice age. Spearheaded by the Panzer Corps led by Generals Guderian and Rommel, German armies smashed into northern France in May 1940. Refuelling at roadside petrol stations, ignoring orders from Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, General Staff, to halt and consolidate, the panzers dashed for the sea and the encirclement of British and French forces. Stukas dive-bombed a smoking path through French defences, and after the miraculous evacuation from Dunkirk, France fell. Its armed forces surrendered, and a humiliating armistice was signed in the forest at Compiègne. By the 28th of June, Adolf Hitler was sightseeing in Paris, triumphant, the master of Western Europe. Southern and eastern France remained unoccupied and under the control of the collaborationist Vichy regime of Marshal Pétain. Throughout the summer of 1940, the sun shone, and life in the south appeared to go on much as before, although many must have been fearful of the future under a government absolutely controlled by the Nazis. But for young people, these concerns were perhaps less immediate. On Sunday the 8th of September 1940, another sunny day dawned, and it was buried treasure, not the war in the north, that was much in the mind of 17-year-old Marcel Ravida. An apprentice garage mechanic in the small town of Montignac in the steep-sided valley of the river Vézère, a tributary of the Dordogne in the Périgord region of central France, he had heard stories of a mysterious hidden cavern in the wooded hillside at Lascaux. With 3 friends and his dog Robot, Marcel walked out of the town on a road leading to an abandoned chateau. Older people had said there was a secret passageway under the house which led to a cavern, a place where treasure had been buried. During the Revolution, a priest known as La Brousse had fled the terror and the guillotine by seeking refuge in the secret cave. Because the chateau had belonged to his family, he knew where to find the entrance. The steep hillside behind the old house had been planted with trees and allowed to revert to wildwood. In the winter of 1920-21, a great storm had blown through the valley of the Vézère and brought down a mature pine tree. Its roots torn out by the force of the wind, the pine had left a surprisingly large hole, and to prevent browsing animals from falling in, farmers had filled it with earth and rubbish. After a fruitless few hours thrashing through the wildwood, Marcel and his friends had found nothing and began to make...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?